In the previous video, we looked at how air enters your nasal cavity through your nostrils here, and ultimately how the nasal cavity connects to the trachea in order to lead air down into your lungs. And in this video, we're going to look at that process in a little bit more detail. Firstly, revisiting the role of the pharynx and comparing how the pharynx functions differently in the digestive system with the respiratory system, and then looking at the rest of the travel that air does in order to get to the lungs and ultimately into your blood. So if we revisit the role of the pharynx, remember that the pharynx is this space in here, right above the opening to your trachea, where air and food are separated by a muscle that we call your epiglottis. Remember that the epiglottis is the muscle that blocks the trachea whenever you eat in order to prevent food going into your lungs. But since we're breathing, the epiglottis actually has the opposite function, and in this case, the epiglottis is going to close your esophagus in order to force air to go down into your trachea here and prevent it from going into your stomach, because obviously you don't want your stomach to become bloated with air because food is supposed to go down there. Now, before it enters the trachea proper, it actually passes this structure here, which is a protective structure that we call your larynx. So you can actually feel your larynx if you take your fingers of your favorite hand and press them against the top of your throat whenever you talk. So the larynx actually sits on top of the trachea, and part of its function is actually to serve a protective role, because the larynx can actually move up and down, protecting the surface of your trachea. And if you hold your fingers on your larynx when you talk or whenever you hum or sing, you can feel the larynx actually vibrate, because the larynx exists to protect your vocal cords as well. So the vocal cords are the muscles that allow you to speak, to sing, and generally to make any other noises involving your voice. But the outside structure of your larynx is made of cartilage, which is the same flexible protein that the outside of your trachea is made of, and once again, it exists to physically protect the outside of your trachea from damage. But we can also see that the larynx is connected to the epiglottis here. In fact, the muscles also connect to your epiglottis, and therefore the larynx, in addition to protecting the outside of the trachea, are also meant to control the epiglottis and prevent you from inhaling food and preventing food from going down your trachea. So if we follow the journey of your air as we pass the larynx and go down the trachea, eventually your trachea are going to break into two long tubes, which are what we call your bronchi. This is the plural form because you have two, because each bronchi or each bronchus is the singular form of this word. Each bronchus is going to go in the opposite direction because you have two lungs. So the job of your bronchi is to take the air from your trachea and divide it up evenly into each of the lungs. And as we can see, if we zoom in on what happens to the bronchi whenever they get into the lungs, we can see that the bronchi further divide into a much larger number of smaller respiratory tubules, which are what we call your bronchioles collectively. And if we follow your bronchioles, so if we trace the pathway that your air takes, eventually we're going to get to near the outermost layer of each of your lungs. And if we follow your bronchioles, so at the end of every one of these small air tubes within your lungs, here we get to these unusual grape-like structures, which collectively are what we call your alveoli. So again, alveoli is the plural form of this word, and the singular form is pronounced alveolus. So this structure here excuse me, is one alveolus, and these two together are a pair of alveoli. And if we had to pick the most important structure of the entire respiratory system, this is it, or rather these are it right here, because this is the location where gas exchange between your lungs and between the capillaries in your blood occurs. So the last topic that we are going to talk about is how exactly the alveoli are used in order to transfer blood. Now, a common feature that we see with alveoli as compared with your small intestines, if you think of the villi within your small intestines, we can see that alveoli are not completely smooth and not completely flat. Many people think that they kind of look like clusters of grapes, and this is intentional because this is meant to increase the amount of surface area that each of the alveoli have, because on the outside of your alveoli are the smallest blood vessels in the body. We can see that your capillaries are found outside your alveoli. So the more surface area your alveoli has, the more capillaries are available, and therefore the faster the diffusion of oxygen into your blood is going to occur, which brings us to how that process actually occurs. So we can see that the walls of your alveoli, as we can see in this diagram here, are only one cell thick, which is a very, very short distance, and that means that the gases that are going to exchange are going to take a lot less time in order to diffuse to where they need to go. So if we follow the pathway of blood and the directions in which gases are moving, our blood in this case is flowing from left to right as it enters the capillaries that are found on the outside of your alveoli here. And we can see in this diagram that your blood is blue, and we colloquially call this blue blood, although the more accurate term for this is deoxygenated blood. So from the prefix DE, DE means to break down or to remove, meaning that deoxygenated blood has no oxygen in it, and therefore this part of your blood must be carrying carbon dioxide. So here, because deoxygenated blood is carrying carbon dioxide that your body wants to get rid of, the carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out of the deoxygenated blood and into the alveoli, and then when you exhale, your lungs are going to push that carbon dioxide out of you so that it doesn't stay in your body. Now, after the carbon dioxide leaves, the oxygen that you have inhaled, that's traveled all the way to the ends of the bronchi to get to the alveoli, all of this oxygen gas is going to diffuse into your blood, causing the blood, at least in this diagram here, to appear red. So red blood, rather than being known as deoxygenated blood, this is what we call oxygenated blood, meaning that this blood is actually carrying oxygen that you have inhaled, because it's going to travel out of the alveoli through the one cell layer thick wall of the alveoli, and then the oxygenated blood is going to be carried out of the lungs. So after the gas exchange takes place, that the carbon dioxide that has been transferred or diffused out of deoxygenated blood that is now in the alveoli, this is going to be exhaled so that your body can get rid of it. Let me just write that more clearly. Exhaled. And the oxygen that is now present within the oxygenated blood that is ultimately leaving the lungs, this blood needs to be transferred to the rest of your body, meaning that we need to get this blood back to your heart so that your heart can pump this oxygen-carrying blood to the rest of your body to supply every cell in the body with the oxygen that they need in order to produce the energy that they need in order to function. This concludes our overview of all of the major structures of the respiratory system. Before you move on to the next series of videos that looks at the mechanism of breathing and how the lungs actually work, take a look at the practice problems below, starting with a case study on chronic obstructive pulmonary lung disease, which looks at what happens to your respiratory system, specifically your alveoli, when they suffer damage, and see if you can answer the questions below about how your breathing and gas exchange would be negatively impacted if the structures of your respiratory system were to take damage.